When the news first broke, it didn't even feel real. My dad, a man who had lived an ordinary life for as long as I could remember, suddenly became worth $350 million overnight. It was one of those moments you read about in newspapers or catch in a documentary. Someone strikes it big, luck finds its way to their doorstep, and suddenly their name means something entirely different. My dad had always been hardworking, a man of structure and routine. He wasn't flashy, never tried to draw attention to himself, and certainly never gave off the impression that he had ambitions of that scale. That's why when I heard the number $350 million, I couldn't process what it really meant. How does a man who was once worried about paying bills suddenly step into a world where money is no longer a concern? At first, it was a kind of surreal pride I felt. I thought maybe things would change for the better. Maybe the weight we had carried as a family would finally lift, and maybe some of the unspoken tensions between us would dissolve. Money has a way of shifting things, and even though people say it doesn't buy happiness, it undeniably brings freedom. Freedom from worry, freedom from debt, freedom from constantly having to choose between needs and wants. I believed that freedom would soften him, make him easier to reach, and maybe even bring us closer together. For a brief moment, I let myself imagine what that life would look like. But the reality of sudden wealth is more complicated than the glossy dream. The first signs of change were small but sharp, the kind that cut without leaving an obvious mark. He started speaking differently, as though every word carried more weight than before. His tone was firmer, his patience shorter, and his opinions suddenly sounded like commands. He spoke of people not as individuals, but as assets or burdens. It was as though his worldview had shifted overnight, like the fortune had unlocked a harsher, colder version of himself that had been buried deep within. The house didn't feel the same. The walls were the same, the furniture was the same, but the energy had shifted. Money has this way of creating distance, even when it hasn't been spent yet. It sits in the air, a silent presence that whispers to you constantly, "Things are different now." He began carrying himself with a kind of authority that wasn't there before, as though he had earned the right to look down on anyone who didn't measure up to his new standard. And I quickly realized I was one of those people. There had always been tension between us, unspoken disagreements, and a lack of understanding. He thought I wasn't living up to his expectations, that I wasn't ambitious enough, that my choices in life didn't align with the vision he had for me. Before the money, those judgments hurt, but they felt survivable. They were words in arguments, silences at dinner tables, or sighs when I made a decision he didn't like. But after the money, those judgments hardened into actions. They were no longer complaints, they became verdicts. I noticed how he spoke about me to others, subtle dismissals, small remarks that carried poison. He was careful, but not careful enough. Suddenly, I was a liability in his story, an obstacle to the image he wanted to create. He was building this persona of success, strength, and control, and I didn't fit into it. I wasn't the shining reflection he wanted to show the world. That's when I began to understand how quickly wealth can divide even the closest of bonds. $350 million doesn't just transform a bank account, it transforms dynamics, expectations, and identities. My dad, who had once taught me about the value of honesty and loyalty, was no longer looking at life through the same lens. His gaze had shifted to status, power, and legacy. And where I once thought I was part of that legacy, I now realized I was being pushed out of the picture. What stung the most wasn't the fortune itself, but the way it made him forget. Forget the years of sacrifice, the shared struggles, the nights when we had nothing but each other. Forget the loyalty I had shown even when our relationship was strained. Forget that I was not just his child, but also a witness to every stage of his life before this windfall. It was as though the past no longer mattered, because the present had been rewritten in bold numbers. I found myself caught between pride and hurt. Pride that he had achieved something so massive, something most people could only dream of. Hurt that in gaining the world, he seemed to lose sight of what truly mattered. It was the kind of contradiction that gnaws at you, the kind that makes you question whether love can really withstand the weight of wealth. Every conversation became a test, every interaction a reminder that I no longer knew the man in front of me the way I once thought I did. It was only the beginning, but even then I could sense that his fortune was about to set events in motion that none of us could have prepared for. And as much as I wanted to believe we could survive this shift, there was already a silent line being drawn between us. It happened without warning, the kind of decision that doesn't come with a build-up or explanation. One moment I was standing in the house that had been mine for years, and the next I was being told to leave. My father didn't hesitate, didn't soften the blow, didn't offer even a trace of warmth when he said it. He had gotten his fortune, and with it came a sense of authority that no one could challenge. His words were sharp, final, and heavy with something that made me feel smaller than I ever had before. I wasn't asked, I wasn't reasoned with, I was simply dismissed, as though my presence no longer belonged within the walls that had once been filled with family memories. The shock of it sat in my chest like a weight I couldn't move. I stared at him, waiting for some sign that he was joking, some flicker of recognition that he understood what he was doing. But his face remained cold, his eyes steady and unshaken. He didn't waver. He didn't hesitate. It was as though this decision had been simmering within him, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. The money had become the catalyst, and I was the sacrifice. There is a particular kind of pain that comes when rejection comes from your own blood. Strangers can betray you, friends can drift away, but when it's your father, the man who raised you, who once promised to protect you, telling you that you no longer have a place, the wound cuts deeper than anything else could. I felt stripped not just of a home, but of belonging. It wasn't about walls or furniture, it was about being cast aside by the person whose approval I had chased my entire life. What made it worse was the way he framed it. It wasn't shouted in anger, it wasn't screamed in the heat of an argument. It was calm, collected, almost businesslike, as though I were no longer his child, but an inconvenience to be managed. That tone lingered with me, because it revealed just how far gone he was, how much the money had already reshaped the way he viewed me. He wasn't acting from emotion, he was acting from calculation. And in his calculations, I didn't fit. The walls of the house seemed to close in around me as I gathered what I could. Every object I touched felt heavier, as though it carried the memory of a life I was no longer allowed to live. Childhood photographs, pieces of furniture I had sat on countless times, even the door I had walked through daily, all of it suddenly felt foreign, as if it no longer belonged to me. Each step toward the exit was a reminder that this place, which had once been my safe space, was no longer mine. My father didn't help, didn't speak, didn't soften. He stood there, watching with the same detached expression, his silence more punishing than any words could have been. It was as if he wanted me to know that this wasn't a momentary lapse, this wasn't an argument we could patch up later. It was deliberate, final, irreversible. The door behind me seemed louder when it closed, echoing in my chest in a way that told me nothing would ever be the same again. On the street, the air felt different. Colder, harsher, unforgiving. I carried a bag with a fraction of my belongings, my mind replaying the moment in a loop. How quickly everything had shifted. Just days ago, I had walked through that house with the assumption that it was still my home. Now, I was standing outside, stripped of stability, stripped of security, stripped of the illusion that family always meant safety. Questions rushed through me. What did I do to deserve this? How could he discard me so easily? Why now? Why in this way? But beneath the questions was something heavier, the realization that the bond between us had always been fragile, and now it had shattered completely. His fortune had only accelerated what had perhaps been waiting all along. There is a kind of silence that follows being thrown out, and it isn't peaceful. It is loud, pressing, filled with echoes of the rejection that just unfolded. I could still hear his voice in my head, still see his expression, still feel the weight of his finality. The world kept moving around me, cars passing, people talking, the city buzzing as it always did. But for me, everything had stopped. Time had split in two, the life before his words, and the life after them. Walking away felt like dragging chains, each step heavier than the last. I wasn't just walking away from a house, I was walking away from the idea of what I thought family was supposed to mean. My father had made it clear that his new world had no space for me, and that clarity was more devastating than any uncertainty could have been. It left me standing in the middle of my own life, no longer sure where I belonged, no longer sure who I was without the place I had once called home. The moment the door shut behind me, the shock gave way to something far heavier. Betrayal does not hit you all at once. It seeps in slowly, like a cold draft through a cracked window. At first, I told myself this couldn't be real, that there must have been some mistake, some misunderstanding. I thought maybe my father would call me back in, that he would soften once the anger settled. But the longer I stood outside with nothing but a small bag in my hand, the truth became undeniable. I had been cast out by the very person who was supposed to be my protector. That realization hit harder than anything else. It wasn't just about being homeless or losing stability. It was about knowing that I had been discarded, intentionally, without hesitation. The betrayal gnawed at me more deeply than the shock itself. This was not a fight with a stranger, not a falling out with a friend, it was blood. It was my father. And that word alone carried so much weight. All my life, I had been told that family is forever, that no matter how hard things get, blood ties hold us together. Yet here I was, proof that sometimes even blood is not enough to keep someone from turning their back on you. Every memory I had of him teaching me values, every lecture about loyalty and resilience, suddenly felt like lies. If those lessons had been real, how could he do this to me? How could a man who once held my hand as a child now push me out into the world like I was nothing? The emotional turmoil was relentless. One part of me wanted to scream, to rage against him, to demand answers. Another part of me wanted to collapse, to let the weight of it crush me entirely. And beneath all of that was a quieter, more painful emotion, disappointment. Not disappointment in myself, but in him. I had always believed that no matter how flawed he was, no matter how much we disagreed, there was still some part of him that loved me unconditionally. To discover otherwise was like having the ground ripped out from under my feet. As the hours passed, I felt anger building where sadness had first taken root. Anger at how little I seemed to mean to him, anger at the way money had twisted him so quickly, anger at myself for not seeing it sooner. I replayed our last conversation in my head over and over, analyzing every word, every look, every gesture. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision. He had been preparing for this, waiting for the right excuse, and the money had given him the confidence to act on it. That realization cut deeper than the act itself. It meant that I hadn't lost him in a single moment. I had been losing him slowly, quietly, without even realizing it. Betrayal changes the way you see the world. Suddenly, every interaction feels suspicious. Every word carries hidden meaning. Every silence feels like rejection. I found myself questioning not just my relationship with my father, but also my own worth. If the man who knew me better than anyone could so easily discard me, what did that say about me? Was I truly that unworthy, that unimportant, that disposable? These questions swirled in my head like a storm I couldn't escape, leaving me restless, exhausted, and hollow. The emotional turmoil didn't stop at thoughts. It consumed my body as well. My chest felt heavy, my stomach knotted, my hands shook whenever I tried to steady myself. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face again, cold and indifferent, telling me to leave. Even the smallest moments, like reaching into my bag or looking around the unfamiliar streets, triggered waves of grief and disbelief. Nothing felt stable anymore. The ground I had stood on my whole life had crumbled beneath me, and I had no idea how to rebuild it. I thought about the years we had struggled together before his windfall, how we had lived paycheck to paycheck, how he had once leaned on me for support when things were tough. I remembered nights when we had sat at the table with nothing but silence and worry, but we had faced it together. And now, when he finally had more than enough to share, he chose to shut me out instead. That betrayal wasn't just about rejection in the present, it erased the meaning of everything we had endured together in the past. If loyalty meant nothing to him now, had it ever really meant anything at all? There was no clear way to process all of it. The shock lingered, the betrayal deepened, and the turmoil twisted itself into every corner of my mind. One moment I would feel numb, the next I would feel furious, and the next I would break into tears I couldn't control. It was as though my emotions were on a carousel I couldn't step off, spinning me around endlessly without giving me a chance to catch my breath. The very foundation of who I thought I was, his child, his blood, his responsibility, was cracked, and I had no idea how to fill the gaps it left behind. The call came sooner than I ever expected. Barely a day had passed since I was standing outside that house, feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me, when my phone lit up with his name. For a moment I thought I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks on me in some cruel attempt to bring relief. But it wasn't imagination. The phone rang again, his number flashing clearly on the screen. My hands trembled as I picked it up, a mix of anger, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name. Just 24 hours ago, this man had thrown me out without hesitation, his voice cold and final. And now he was calling me. The sound of his voice on the other end was nothing like the one I'd heard when he cast me out. It was no longer firm, no longer controlled, no longer dripping with authority. Instead, it was shaky, hurried, and desperate. He didn't ease into the conversation or even pretend to be calm. He went straight into it, his words tumbling over each other, almost as if he feared that if he didn't speak fast enough, I might hang up. That desperation was the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong. For a moment, I didn't know how to react. Part of me wanted to hang up immediately, to remind him of the way he had treated me just a day earlier. Another part of me wanted to stay silent, to let him squirm, to make him feel the weight of what he had done. But curiosity pinned me to the call. What could have happened in such a short span of time that would turn my father, a man who had suddenly become untouchable with his fortune, into someone begging for help? The contrast was almost surreal. Less than 24 hours earlier, he had stood taller, colder, certain of his choices. He had looked at me with eyes that carried no hesitation, no trace of doubt. And now his voice cracked with every sentence. He sounded small, cornered, and afraid, like someone who had been stripped of the power he had so quickly grown accustomed to. It was almost difficult to reconcile that this was the same man. But money has a way of drawing shadows, and maybe those shadows had closed in faster than he expected. He tried to explain, but his words came out jumbled, fragments of sentences that didn't connect. There was urgency in his tone, as if time was against him. I caught phrases, people showing up, threats being made, things getting out of hand. I couldn't piece it all together, but I didn't need to. His desperation said enough. He was in trouble. Serious trouble. And the irony wasn't lost on me, that after shutting me out so completely, I was suddenly the one he needed. Hearing him like that stirred emotions I didn't know how to handle. Anger and hurt still burned hot in me, but layered beneath them was something more complicated. No matter how much I wanted to detach, he was still my father. Hearing him plead, hearing that edge of fear in his voice, awakened the part of me that had always wanted to help him, to protect him, even when he had failed to do the same for me. But it wasn't easy to ignore the sting of what had just happened a day earlier. His words of rejection echoed in my memory, clashing with the urgent cries now spilling from his mouth. The shift in power between us was undeniable. Just yesterday, he had held all the control. He had the money, the authority, the house, and the ability to decide who stayed and who left. I had walked away with nothing, stripped of dignity and belonging. And yet, here he was, stripped of the same power he had clung to so tightly, reaching out to the very person he had tried to discard. The tables had turned, though I hadn't asked for them to. As I listened, I realized that this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about fear, vulnerability, and the sudden realization that wealth cannot shield you from everything. He had thought the fortune made him invincible, untouchable, beyond the need for anyone else. But in just 24 hours, reality had shown him otherwise. He was human again, flawed, scared, and in need of help. And for reasons I couldn't fully understand, he was turning to me. Every second of that call carried weight. His voice was heavy with things left unsaid, with guilt, with desperation that made him stumble over his words. He didn't apologize outright, but I could hear the cracks forming in his pride. That pride, which had once seemed so unshakable, was crumbling beneath the pressure of whatever storm had found him. And though I hadn't yet decided what to do, one truth was clear in that moment. The man who had cast me out into the cold now saw me as the one person who could save him. When he finally began to explain himself, The story came out in fragments, each word heavier than the last. The desperation I had heard in his voice over the phone wasn't just a moment of panic, it was rooted in something much darker. He had made mistakes, careless mistakes, the kind that money attracts like flies to honey. The $350 million that had seemed like his greatest triumph had quickly turned into his greatest liability. People he thought were friends had surfaced from the shadows, smiling, congratulating him, showering him with attention, only to start circling closer with intentions that were far from pure. Businessmen he barely knew pitched him deals too good to be true, and instead of questioning, he let himself be flattered by their interest. Strangers whispered promises of doubling his fortune, of legacy, of power, and he had believed them. It didn't take long before those promises soured. The deals were built on lies, the contracts carried traps, and the people who had appeared to celebrate him had been waiting for a chance to exploit him. By the time he realized it, the damage was already unfolding. His phone was filled with demands, threats wrapped in polite words, veiled reminders of what could happen if he didn't cooperate. He had thought the money would put him above everyone else, but it had only made him a target. The world he had stepped into was not one of comfort and luxury. It was a battlefield. Hearing him unravel this, I felt an odd mix of emotions. Part of me thought he deserved it. He had been so quick to dismiss me, so quick to believe his wealth made him invincible. And yet now, with that same money weighing him down, he sounded like a child lost in the dark, clutching at anything familiar. But another part of me felt something close to pity. This was a man who had always prided himself on control, on strength, on being unshakable, and now he was caught in a web he didn't know how to escape. The cracks in his voice weren't just fear, they were humiliation. The desperation deepened when he confessed that it wasn't just shady businessmen or fake friends pressing in on him. There were others, people far less patient, far less concerned with appearances. He described men showing up near the house, cars parked for too long outside, strangers lingering just long enough to make him uneasy. He had brushed it off at first, but when one of them slipped a note under the door, everything shifted. The note wasn't long, but it was enough to shake him, a reminder that they knew where he lived, that money wasn't his to hide behind. That was when the fear had settled in, the kind that strips away pride and ego until all that's left is raw survival. What struck me most was how quickly he admitted that he didn't know who else to turn to. With all his money, with all the new people orbiting around him, he had no one he could truly trust. He hadn't built bonds, he had built dependencies, alliances that lasted only as long as the money flowed. And when trouble came, those people disappeared, leaving him standing alone in the chaos he had created. That was why he had called me. Not because I had power, not because I had money, but because I was the last person who might still care enough to answer. Listening to him, I realized that this was more than desperation, it was downfall. He wasn't the man standing tall in his new wealth anymore. He was someone unraveling, cornered by forces larger than himself, powerless despite the fortune sitting in his account. That fortune had been the reason he pushed me away, and now it was the very thing pulling him back toward me. The irony was sharp, almost cruel, yet undeniable. His words painted a picture of a man who had built his house on sand. He had thought $350 million would make him untouchable, but in less than a day, it had brought him to his knees. The confidence, the arrogance, the cold certainty with which he had thrown me out, all of it had evaporated. Now, every word he spoke carried the weight of fear, guilt, and an unmistakable plea. He wasn't asking me to admire his success anymore. He was asking me to save him from it. It was a strange shift to witness, a complete reversal of roles. Just a day earlier, he had looked at me as though I were nothing, as though my presence was a stain on his new life. Now he was reaching out to me as though I were the only lifeline left. I could hear the cracks in his pride, the way his voice broke when he admitted he didn't know what else to do. He wasn't the man who had pushed me out anymore. He was just a man scared, vulnerable, and suddenly aware that the empire he thought he had gained was nothing but a fragile illusion waiting to collapse. The balance between us shifted in a way I never thought possible. Just a day earlier, I had been the one stripped of power, walking away from the house with nothing but a small bag and the bitter sting of rejection. He had stood tall, armed with wealth, certainty, and the authority to decide who belonged and who didn't. In that moment, I was powerless, left to carry the weight of abandonment. But now, as I listened to him pleading, his voice cracking under the pressure of fear, I realized that everything had turned. The control he had clung to so tightly had slipped through his fingers, and for the first time in my life, it was me who held the upper hand. It wasn't power in the sense of money or influence. I didn't suddenly gain fortune or status. What I had was something he no longer did: trust, loyalty, and the knowledge that when the world closed in, he couldn't rely on anyone but me. That realization changed everything. I had been invisible to him, cast aside as if I were nothing, but now he needed me more than he needed the millions sitting in his account. That need gave me leverage he never imagined I would have. There was something surreal about hearing him speak to me in a tone I had never heard before. Gone was the commanding voice that had thrown me out without hesitation. In its place was hesitation, vulnerability, even humility. He stumbled over his words, careful not to sound too demanding, careful not to push me away again. It was almost strange to witness my father, who had always been so proud and unyielding, now speaking with the kind of fragility that made him sound almost human again. The pride that once filled every sentence was gone, stripped away by the weight of circumstances he couldn't control. I could feel the shift not just in his voice, but in the silence that followed between us. For years, silence had been a weapon he used, a way of making me feel small, unimportant, undeserving of explanation. Now, silence weighed on him. It was as though he feared that if I didn't respond, if I let the quiet linger too long, it would mean I had chosen to abandon him the way he had abandoned me. That fear made him vulnerable in a way I had never seen. The silence wasn't my punishment anymore, it was his. The tables turning wasn't about revenge, though the thought lingered in the back of my mind. It was about clarity. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be dependent, to have no control, to need someone else in a way that couldn't be bought or forced. He had built his world on money, status, and appearances, but all of it crumbled in the face of real danger. And in that collapse, the only thing that mattered was the one person he had tried to erase from his life. That person was me. It made me think about how fragile power really is. He had believed that money put him above everyone else, that it gave him the right to control not just his future, but mine as well. But money couldn't buy loyalty, it couldn't buy safety, and it couldn't buy the kind of bond he had severed so carelessly. What he had dismissed as weakness, my compassion, my willingness to stay even when things were hard, was suddenly the one thing he needed most. And that realization wasn't just his. It was mine too. The power shift was not loud or dramatic, it was quiet, subtle, but undeniable. It was in the way his voice faltered, the way he paused before asking for help, the way he admitted things he never would have confessed before. Every word he spoke was layered with the knowledge that he had burned the bridge between us, and now he was standing on the edge, hoping I would rebuild it. That hope gave me a strength I had never felt before. As I listened, I couldn't help but reflect on how different we were in that moment compared to just one day earlier. He had believed his money made him untouchable, and I had believed his rejection defined me. But now he was the one defined by need, and I was the one with the choice. The same man who had thrown me out into the cold was now asking to be let back into my world, not with authority, but with desperation. The weight of that irony wasn't lost on me. The tables had turned, but not in a way that made me feel triumphant. It wasn't about winning or proving him wrong. It was about finally seeing the truth that real power doesn't come from money or control. It comes from the ties we choose to protect, the bonds we choose to value, and the loyalty we refuse to betray. In that moment, I understood that the person who had once made me feel powerless was now at my mercy, not because of what I had gained, but because of what he had lost.